Now, the other thing that I feel like a lot of the business owners that I work with struggle with is they feel like everything is on their shoulders. If they won't do the job, if they won't manage the technicians or the sales reps or whatever it is, the business would crash. And it's I think that this is maybe one of the biggest bottlenecks for small businesses. And I'm wondering how you see it and how you see that the transition happen successfully, whether it's in terms of compensation, whether it's where you hire those skilled people to come for an operational role. How do you see the shift from being the owner operator into being basically the owner and visionary and maybe like title president of the company? Sure. We focus more on the strategic component of the business rather than the day-to-day operation.
So I think there are a lot of ways to answer this question. So one is we have a piece on our website called The Kingdom or the Crown. And we think that's a fairly good analogy when you're talking to somebody who has maintained a lot of control in the business. People have maintained control for a lot of reasons, some of which are incredibly valid. If it's your net worth that's tied up in the business, there's a natural inclination to control the environment and to control the outcome. And most entrepreneurs are pretty darn capable of doing a lot, right? So it's not that it's a bad decision at some scale of the organization to, carry the weight on your shoulders, as you put it, right? But the question is, is it more important that it's on your shoulders, or is it more important that you're building something that can last beyond you, right? And so that's the metaphor that we make on is it a kingdom that you are building that should last for successive generations, or do you just want to wear a crown and be in charge, right? And it's okay if you identify that you're just going to be in charge, but then you don't have a sellable business, right? Because you ostensibly at some point will leave. And so the business has to be manageable without you. So that's kind of the macro version I would give is the kingdom or the crown, because I think it's a good way of thinking about why you're doing what you're doing. But then on a day-to-day basis, obviously it's far more gradual in terms of how you make these decisions. I think what often happens is that somebody tries to make a key hire, and you mentioned compensation, which is a key component of this. They make their most expensive hire, right? A six-figure employee for the first time, as an example. And they have grand aspirations of what that person is going to be able to take off their plate personally and be able to do for building the business long term. And then it turns out that person is not as great as what they would have expected, as big as their aspirations for them were. And they feel like they got gypped because it's now a really expensive person on the payroll if they keep them. Sometimes it doesn't even work out and they fire them. But if they keep them, then they're like, you know what? Well-paying employees aren't worth it. I'm going back to just hiring people who can do purely executional work, and I'm just going to stay in charge. And what I call that is you've identified that you've got a problem, but you've identified it as the role and not the person, right? So maybe the role is still what you need, but you just hired the wrong person for that role. It doesn't mean that the role is invalid, but you've decided that because you already made the investment, you made the decision, and you don't want to take it back, right? And so this is actually a reason that we end up doing some deals, is that people have had bad experiences in trying to diversify their management team and add key people at, not insignificant compensation structures, and they just feel out of their depth. They feel like they get taken advantage of by some people, and then in other cases, they feel like they hired but didn't get the skill sets or the capabilities that they thought when they did that. And so when you're making managerial hires, it can be helpful both for it to not be just your equity dollars that are paying for that person, right? So there's sort of a diversification of who wants to spend money money on proactive hiring, which can be a reason why you bring on an investor. And then there's also, where do you go look for talent? And that's a big component, I think, of why some smaller companies partner with firms like ours, is to be able to attract people who may not go to a local business and just say, I want to be hired at a local business. But when that business is part of a larger network of opportunity and they feel like they can see a career path that is bigger in scale, you can attract some talent that you may not otherwise have access to, and design incentive structures that tie them to the growth of the business in really interesting ways. And so, there's a talent opportunity set that factors into this, because if you don't have anyone you can delegate to, then you are kind of stuck with everything being on your shoulders. And then once you have people in place that you can potentially delegate to, I think the final step is just figuring out, what do you want to work on and what do you want to do? And I have this conversation with almost anyone we potentially are going to do a deal with, but most entrepreneurs and most operators are like pretty passionate about work. They enjoy what they do. And when you've done something for 20 some odd years, like, it's kind of hard to rip yourself out of it. Some people are ready, but the vast majority are not. And instead, what's ended up happening is potentially, like, they've ended up with a bunch of admin work on their plate that they didn't ask for or didn't want in the beginning. Or their role has become murky because there's too much redundancy. And so they don't have like a true thing that they can own and drive the business forward with. So you end up in this like no man's land of just like a bunch of stuff on your plate, and you don't know what to do with it. And so, we have this conversation with our operators every 6 months on, what's on your plate that you actually enjoy, what's on your plate that you believe is materially driving the business forward, and what's on your plate that has to be done, but you don't enjoy doing, right? And then the natural steps are to get the stuff you don't enjoy but is important off your plate first, right? And then to figure out what of the things that like is an overlap on what you enjoy and what materially adds value to the business, and try and increase your focus and your time on those things, right? So for a lot of founders in particular, especially engineers by mindset or trade, they're like product people, they're problem solvers, and the best version of themselves is not oftentimes leading the business. It is leading product or leading some element of manufacturing that is about advancing either the solutions they're creating or the process by which they're creating them, which is an incredibly vital role to growing the organization, but it's not necessarily like the CEO role, right? And so we have this conversation both pre and post close with a lot of people around just like, what do you want to do? And let's figure out how to, hire for skill sets that solve for the things that you don't want to be doing. Make sure we do that stuff first and give you more time to focus on the things you do enjoy doing. And then, over time, obviously the succession to that is making sure that we find people you enjoy spending time with who share similar skill sets that can be trained up and, essentially like apprentice with you, so that long-term they can take over those responsibilities as well, so that you never feel beholden to the business. Because I think that's where like, it's sure there's like a heavy burden in the crown, but the worst version is when you feel like you can't take it off. And so you've got to get to a point where you have people and have faith in those people that they can steward it without you. And that's a pretty important role that organizations like ours are involved in when we partner with businesses, in that planning phase. And it's again why selling 100% on day one is a harder transaction for everybody involved.
Right. Yeah, and I think that ego is a big component of taking that crown, so to speak, for a lot of
for sure,
entrepreneurs. Yeah, and I think first of all, I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, ego it always plays a role. But there's helpful ego, right? And then there's the version of ego that keeps you from moving forward. And when you are holding on to control for ego reasons, like that's not actually helping you. So it's a component that you have to gain some self-awareness around in order to be able to solve for it.